I know I talk a lot about hospitality on this podcast, and if you've been around a while, you know why I do. It's not the same as entertaining. Do you understand the difference enough to go ahead and open your home for heaven's sake? Today we have Dr. Janice Brown to talk about rethinking biblical hospitality. Dr. Brown is a specialist in the work of C.S. Lewis and Dorothy Sayers, and she's taught on the college level for years, as well as high school English, some of the time for missionary kids in Papua New Guinea with Wycliffe Bible Translators. And this is how we got connected, because I spent some time in Papua New Guinea with Wycliffe, but also she knows my dear brother Hyatt Moore and his lovely wife Anne. Welcome, Janice. Please tell us a little bit about your family and where you're from.
I'm from St. John's, Newfoundland, Canada, and I have a husband still with me after 56 years, and the joy of having three children, all married, wonderful Christian families, and I have six grandchildren,
Right.
all growing up to love God. So that's the greatest joy.
It is the greatest joy. Bless you. And do they live in your area or no?
I have my son is 10 minutes away. My daughter is 55 minutes away, and then I have other daughter in Kansas City.
Oh, wow.
Which is, because I'm in northwestern Pennsylvania, that's almost about 800 miles. So that's it's a good ways.
Yeah. What is your definition of hospitality, and why does that matter to you?
Well, the narrower definition of hospitality is to invite someone into your home and offer them food and or accommodation. But the wider definition of hospitality, I think one we need to think about more these days, is to invite someone into your space, your time, your schedule, offer them your attention, your focus, your concern. And it's fundamentally an attitude towards other people.
Oh, I agree. Some people call it the inviting life. I like to call it the hospitality antenna. So like you wake up in the morning and say, I wonder who God wants to put in my life today.
Right.
Right. So how have you developed that?
Well, I've developed it because I've had the heritage of people who always, parents and grandparents and just, everyone in my circle did it a lot because, 50 years ago, people always did hospitality.
So true.
But in recent years, I found that the world is very different and you have to think differently about it quite often.
For example?
Well, to do a dinner party type meal for friends was what we always did when I was first married. Sometimes now you do that for people, it is almost confrontational. They're not quite sure how to respond. And so you have to be sensitive to what you serve them and how you serve it. It may not be that that's as complimentary and as comforting as you thought it would be.
I wonder why that is.
I think people are more informal these days.
Oh.
To come into a home with the table is laid with the napkins in place and the crystal on the table. A lot of people feel like, oh, I couldn't do that. Oh, why am I even here?
Well, that goes into our next question. How is biblical hospitality different from the popular conception?
Well, I think it's countercultural because it's not based on the quality of what you provide, but the quality of the interaction you're able to foster. I think that more resources in a literal sense is considered to be a improvement in your capacity for hospitality, more money, a better home, more know-how, a live-in chef for cooking expertise yourself. Whereas I think biblical hospitality is greatest when we live within our own inadequacies, not just accepting them, but really celebrating them and realizing that in our inadequacy, God shows his adequacy.
Yeah, I love I loved it one time when my friend came in and she goes, "Oh, now I feel better about my house." And that was not a compliment because my house was a mess, but I'd seen her house. But I thought, okay, my gift to her that day, Janice, was to make her feel more comfortable about herself. And that's part of hospitality, is kind of what you're saying, not to be confrontational with our wealth or our big house or crystal or napkins that are folded. I mean, people give me linen napkins these days, and I go, boy, do I really want to iron those? But back in the day, I would. And some people like it. You know what? This reminds me of something. After I spoke on this once, a lady came up to me afterwards and she goes, but I do love to put on the dog. She didn't say it that way, but I knew what she was saying. And I said, you know what? You're gifted that way and God loves it. So it's not like we don't do it if we really are comfortable, but we don't keep that image of hospitality keep us from doing any hospitality. Would you agree?
Yeah. Yes, that's true. I made the mistake one time of inviting some folks in from the college where I was teaching. And one lady in particular I wanted to get to know because I had a few conversations with her at college events. But I had felt like doing something fiddly. I think I made chicken croquettes or something. And it didn't dawn on me that it would be upsetting to her. She followed me out to the kitchen
Hmm.
and she said, I have to confess to you, I do not know how to cook. And
Oh,
I can barely put food on the table for my family that's edible.
hmm.
I was so shocked, not at her inability to cook, but on her feeling the need to tell me
Tell
that.
you, yeah.
And
Why?
it was hours later before I thought of what I should have said, which was, are you then telling me you can't be my friend?
Oh,
I think she would have understood.
mhm,
But I was humiliated because I realized I had humiliated her.
mhm.
And that lady had a farm. She had goats. She had all kinds of fun things about her that I didn't
Admired.
have about me, and I would have loved to get to know. But that incident where she basically groveled and felt like nothing, and I wasn't able to answer properly.
Mhm.
It was so disappointing to me because I felt like I really blew it in doing that kind of meal when I didn't know how she would feel.
Yeah, it reminds me of the old Reader's Digest. Remember Reader's Digest?
Oh, yes.
There was a great story about this wealthy person who had had a dinner party where everybody came in dinner jackets. Now, I've never been to a dinner party like that, but I would love reading about them, right? Because I read a
Mhm.
lot of novels. And so everybody came in with dinner jackets except for one guest who didn't know, didn't have the wherewithal or even the knowledge to have worn a dinner jacket. And so when he came in, the host took off his jacket and put it on the back of his chair, and then everybody followed suit. And it kind of makes me cry because I
Yeah.
thought, what a beautiful
Yeah.
example of what God does for us, that he sent Jesus, who was so humble, the suffering servant, and he invited us to himself, and he became the lowliest of the low, which reminds me of this quote, which I'd like your thoughts on it. Hospitality began with God, so when we invite, we are a little bit more like him. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of ways in which you can apply that. One is in creativity.
Mm,
Some people have said, and particularly Dorothy Sayers, who I did my research work on, that to be made in the image of God is to be made with the capacity to create.
mm,
And I think if you take creating in a very narrow sense, would say, oh, well, you mean a person whose job allows them no creativity is not going to be close to God. I think creativity in the sense of being able to make something, even if it's figurative, even if it's to make conversation or to make someone feel loved. But creativity, quite often, of course, in the usual form of hospitality, is making something for someone, whether it's just you know, a pizza or a sandwich or a cup of coffee with a store-bought cookie. There's something creative, but also the nurturing factor. God is our provider.
mm.
There's a nurturing factor there. And so those are several ways in which we can be like God in our service to others. And I think one more thing I thought of as you had mentioned that question to me earlier was that I think it's offering stability sometimes to people who
Mhm.
have no stability in their lives. If you
Yes.
have the blessing of a stable home, especially like I'm fine inviting young people, inviting college students to my home when I was a professor, and I still do, even though I'm no longer working. They see there's sort of a stability there. And I think, again, there's something like the fatherhood of God in that.
I totally agree. And that just yesterday we had a young family we just met the Sunday before, and we had them for just chocolate chip pancakes and sausage because that was easy and they had very young children. I figured they would need to get home. And it was a delightful time. But when the men were outside swinging the kids, because yes, we have swings, even though we don't have grandchildren yet, we're waiting. Those swings are waiting. Um, that the mother and I were able to talk about her upbringing and some really hard things in her upbringing. And I thought, okay, Lord, you're calling me into this young woman's life, maybe more than just today. And I felt
Yes.
like we were off. I love that word that you use. We offer stability. That we have a college. We're in a college town, Cal Poly University, and our church has a thing where we adopt college students for the 4 years that they're here. And I think what a blessing. In fact, one time when my daughter was at USC, she called in the middle of our dinner, and I said, "I can't talk. Our college student is over for dinner." And it made her feel bad because no one ever adopted her when she was at USC for 4 years. And I thought, what a shame. They missed out on knowing my daughter.
Yeah.
So three things: creativity, nurturing, and stability. Yes, and God does that for all of us. That's beautiful. How might the expectations of our guests, maybe we already touched on this a little bit, differ from ours in ways that are problematic? Is that what you were talking about with your friend?
Yes, in a way, but I think also the idea of understanding what invitation is. Like a lot of people who have never been invited to someone's home to come at a specific time for a specific reason don't realize that you need a response.
Oh, yeah.
And you feel like, oh, how rude they are if they don't get back to you. But sometimes it's just because they don't understand that you were
Right.
going to prepare something for them and that you needed to know. I mean, it might seem like a no-brainer to us, but
Yes,
it isn't to everybody.
that's so true.
And I think that, and we have the expectation of the host that our guests will come on time. A lot of people, that's not a big deal. They don't realize that you've prepared something that needs to be eaten at a certain time.
Mhm.
They might not know that it's not appropriate to bring other people with them.
Right.
You know, what we expect of guests and what they think a guest should be, sometimes can be very different. And I think we have to be flexible with that. And we figure that the host should have control. The host should say, okay, we've sat chatting over our crackers and cheese long enough. It's time to go to the table now. The
Mhm.
guest doesn't say, oh, no, I want to sit here for a while longer. You know, the only thing the guest has control over, really, I suppose, is when they leave. And sometimes they haven't got common sense enough to know to leave at a good time.
Yeah.
And my father used to joke sometimes, let's go to bed now. These people want to go home.
Yeah. I love that.
But another friend has a joke where he says to his family when they're over and he's getting tired, he says, you don't have to go home, but you can stay here.
A really good one. I have to remember that my husband
But
would
but
just walk up the stairs. I go, honey, you have to say goodnight at least. You don't just wander off. And he said, well, I don't want to make him feel badly.
yeah, but I think that Christian hospitality, you have to be aware that people's understanding of the role of host and guest,
Mm,
of even something as simple as an invitation, may not be the same as yours,
yeah.
and you have to be flexible and consider their point of view may be different from yours on that.
Oh my gosh. And it seems especially with college students. And I had invited four college girls over who had indicated they'd come for Easter and they wanted to come back just by themselves, not with a crowd. And so I sent out this invitation. I got the RSVPs. They were all coming. And so I made food on Saturday because it was going to be after church on Sunday. And that morning, I hear from one who says, oh, can we do it in a couple weeks? That's what she said to me. I said, well, no, I'm not really busy. I'm busy in a couple weeks and I already made all the food. Well, she felt terrible. She understood. And so she came and then she brought an extra person. The combination of that
I
was
know.
pretty darn funny. Oh, and then my daughter say, Mom has the gift of telling people when to go home. So I try to say, like, my husband gets up at 4:30, so this is needs to kind of
Yeah, yeah.
understand.
I think you need to be frank with people quite often, and if you do it kindly, again, you think that maybe it's not the host place.
Yeah,
In some
right.
cases, it may be the host place to make those kind of
Yeah.
invitations.
And it's part of, I guess, adding stability, like we are teaching them how to behave a little bit. They missed out somehow, maybe because of all the
Right.
how they were raised, and their own parents were not hospitable, and that's really often the
Yeah.
case.
Yeah.
This one young man we had for dinner, and because he's pre-med and my husband's a doctor, so we had him for dinner, he's a student. And so, but he's from Brazil originally. And so his mother was visiting from New Jersey. She lives there now. And he goes, I'd like my mother to meet you. I go, great. I said, like what time, and I was giving him time, so that didn't work out. So finally he said, okay, let's do lunch. I said, all right. So I defrosted something quickly, and I was going to make lunch the next day. And then he said, well, let's go out. And I said, okay. So then we're both driving to the restaurant and find out that the restaurant's closed. And then he calls me and he says, well, we can come to your house. And I go, I didn't prepare anything. And I could hear his mother in the background, like, don't make her do something right now. So we ended up going to another restaurant, but it was just so funny. I just thought, this
Yeah.
is a clueless young man who doesn't understand the
I
work
know.
that we go through.
I know.
Oh dear, that was pretty funny. Um, how is biblical hospitality able to change lives for God's kingdom? I'm sure you've seen some
Well,
examples.
I think that a lot of people haven't received any kind of acceptance or respect in their lives. And this may apply more to like church ministries of hospitality to the homeless, although there's no reason why Christian people can't entertain very poor people in their homes, but sometimes there's a barrier to that. I can talk about that under another question, but I think that that need for acceptance, recognition, a sort of giving them a sense of their own dignity and worth is so important. Um, One of the early church fathers, Chrysostom, I always find his name hard to pronounce, uh, that was quoted in one of the books I used for my hospitality course, said that you have to make the stranger that you comes to your home feel like they're doing you a favor by being there. Don't do anything to make them feel like you're bestowing on them as
Mm,
something that they should be surprised at or not feel worthy of. And so the importance of giving them a sense of dignity. Um, Christine Pohl, whose book Making Room, I used quite a bit in my research on hospitality for the course I taught on. It said that people think that hospitality is quaint because they don't understand the power of recognition.
wow. Hmm,
So I think that that is the way people can come to respect who you are and who God is.
hmm. I know recently I was talking about hospitality to a young moms group, and I was saying, when we're feeling low or lonely or depressed, we don't want to take that extra step to invite somebody over, but that would help us to do that, to get out of our lonely state. But then I think often it might be actually the person that you're inviting over that needs it even more than you do. And
Right.
so when we do it out of obedience, whether we feel like it or not, God uses it to help us both. I call it self-serving sanctification when we obey God with this, because it
Right.
always helps us as well. What main barriers prevent people from offering biblical hospitality, and what barriers have you had to overcome, Janice?
Well, biblical hospitality greatly stresses inviting strangers, people of the family of God and strangers. The word strangers is used over and over again, Old Testament scriptures particularly, and in the New Testament. And that is hard. It's hard for modern people because of the risk factor involved.
Mm,
And we live in a world where people are defensive. Henry Nouwen said, our society seems to be increasingly full of fearful, defensive, aggressive people anxiously clinging to their property and inclined to look at their surrounding world with suspicion. But still, that is our vocation, to convert the enemy into the guest
mm,
and to create the free and fearless space where brotherhood and sisterhood can be formed and fully experienced.
mm. Such a beautiful quote. And it's so true, because that is the biblical definition, is to invite the stranger. And when I say that, people are shocked. But when I studied that years ago, I was shocked too. I thought, I didn't know that's what it meant. But it's what my mother did, and probably what your mother did. Every Sunday, she would look out to see who was new, and they were a stranger to
Yeah.
her. So she invited them over.
Yeah.
Yeah, probably a little different than a homeless man on the corner, but you can do that too. I've had
Right.
to warn my family.
Right. And the other thing that uh, prevents people, of course, is one that you and I touched on earlier in our conversation, is a sense of inadequacy. And that ties in with, I think, something that you had suggested for a question later, but I think I'd like to mention it now, that so many people feel, especially in this day and age when cooking full meals for a family on a regular basis is not part of many people's lifestyle. They just don't have the time. They haven't had the exposure to learn how. They haven't had the need, so it's easier to do pre-made things. And then they feel, oh, it's inadequate to do that and to entertain. But God uses what we have. In the two Bible stories that I find most relate to this topic is when Jesus fed the 5,000 and 4,000. It's more than one Bible story. Obviously, there's several feedings of the multitude, but he didn't just create the food. He used what was there, and then he made that enough.
Mhm.
And then when the disciples were fishing after his resurrection, and he was on the beach, he had already prepared fish on the coals, but he took their fish and used as well.
Right. And I call that the
Uh,
First Baptist potluck because
yeah, yeah.
he had what they needed, but he invited us to be part of it, which is all grace.
Yeah. And so that goes back to the whole idea of our inadequacies. I think we have, as Christians practicing hospitality, to realize that that is where we start with our inadequacies and giving what we can give. And if it's a matter of saying to a neighbor family or a new family in the church, we just usually have pizza on Friday nights. We're going to order pizza. Would you like to come
Mhm.
and share it with us? That's hospitality.
Oh, totally. Go ahead.
But I think hospitality can even be things like stopping to help someone by the side of the road or calling a friend who you haven't seen for a long while and spending time talking to her when you have a lot of other things you'd rather be doing. And, she says the same thing all the time, and you don't think you can really say
Over.
anything to encourage her, but still just give her your time.
Mhm.
I think that's hospitality too.
I do too. I do too. And I think we learned how to be more creative during COVID when we weren't allowed to have people in our homes and to put things on people's porches to let them know that you were thinking of them. That's how I found out one of our neighbors was gluten-free because I was passing out lemon cake on everybody's porch or lemons because everybody where I live has a lemon tree because I live in California.
Yeah.
But I was passing them out. Then I found out from her husband, oh, well, she's gluten-free. So then the next time I made a gluten-free treat. You just find out these things by giving out of
Yeah.
obedience. It's God's pricking our conscience and saying, I love what you said. Well, that person's kind of annoying, but I'm going to go ahead and call them because they need it. Yeah.
Yes, and I think also, I was thinking about this as I was preparing for today, that there are so many single people, especially in the church and especially women, whether divorced or widowed or never married. And quite often it will be, and this is something you have to be sensitive to, well, very important to consider them when you're inviting a group in, because in many cases they are just as happy to come, even if the rest are couples, and you can
Right.
find out that by a few discreet questions.
Mhm.
Or just invite them to share time with your family. Just being with a family can be not embarrassing, but just really enjoyable and encouraging. But also for many people to spend time with them just one-on-one. But I think it's so easy because I have a few friends in that situation, and I've sometimes caught myself up not thinking to include them when it's couples, that I think that it's easy for them to get left out. Maybe not so much today as it was even 20 years ago, because it was a newer thing then to have a lot of single people in church groups, and it's perhaps much more common now.
Did you notice when you were in Papua New Guinea how many single missionaries there were?
Oh yes,
Yeah. And see,
single
I went to
women.
mission field single when I went to Brazil, and my roommate was a single missionary from England. And she told me, Sue, you're only going to be here 2 years. I was teaching high school down there. And she said, so you need to make friends. I said, okay, I need friends. I understand that. And so she said, so let's invite a group of people over from the base, the missionary base. We did it every Friday night for 5 or 6 weeks. I made the same thing. I made apple crisp every time. And she did the invitation list and she mixed families with singles. And she told me later that some of the singles came to her and said, thank you so much for including us with the families because often we're put in our own little space.
Yes, yeah, I think
Yeah, I
that's
wouldn't have known that.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, so great. Yeah, that's a great point. Do you think the church is doing all it can to help people who are lonely in the church, not just the stranger on the street?
I don't know. I can speak for many churches. I live in a small town in Pennsylvania. Our church has all college, mostly college kids. We have like half our congregation is college kids, and
It's fun.
I think only 5% of our congregation is over 50. So
Wow.
it's there you don't tend to find that many lonely people in the younger age groups, but it is it is something I'm sure the churches have to tend to make sure they don't overlook. I don't have experience of being in a church where that happens. And we don't live in a big center where there's homeless shelters.
Mm.
But a church I'm connected with a bit in this my summer months when we spend time in Newfoundland. Well, we live in the country there too, but the city church that we attend, they actually have a piece of their property on their an older house that was once a manse on their property that is a homeless shelter run by the municipal and provincial government. But because they're renting the building for that use, they have wonderful opportunities to reach homeless people, and a lot of homeless people come to their midweek dinner that they have, and so. I see how that can work for churches that are in cities where you have a population that are especially needy.
Mm.
I'm sure there's poor people in the country too, but like it's harder to pinpoint where they are and reach them than it is in cities for some reason.
Now, we've touched on this earlier, but what is the function of food and how can we feel free to do hospitality if we are insecure about the kitchen, like you mentioned with your friend, or that you just don't like cooking? I have friends who just don't like it.
Well, I think that realizing that you can do informal kind of gatherings and that it doesn't have to even be food, that you could say our family is going to a fun park. Would you like to join us and spend the day, our two families together? I mean, if you think creatively, there's a lot of things you can do, but I think that um, there's not the great expectation these days that things are homemade. I remember when I used to have my students in when I taught at Grove City College, I did it several times in a row. And then one of my students said, Dr. Brown, where do you buy your desserts? And I said, I don't buy my desserts. I make them. Oh, like she had never known anybody who made a dessert. She was quite shocked and
Yeah,
impressed.
that's pretty funny.
But I think that a lot of people would be fine with
Yeah.
store-bought pre-made things. I think it's something that people need to get past. I think actually maybe there's more insecurity about one's home and like you were saying, having it tidy and organized. Sometimes that can make people feel less comfortable than if you are disorganized. But I think that the problem is for me, and perhaps you would be the same, if I don't tidy up before people come, I feel disorganized in my mind.
Mm.
My husband says, "Why are you so particular about that person? Their house is never tidy." And I say, "Yes, but I feel like it's you can break old habits sometimes. You feel
That's
like you're going to pick
and
up
also we
the
just
pieces."
allow the person to be themselves. Like I just talked to someone recently about this, and she goes, "Well, I personally don't want anybody in my house unless it's clean." I go, "Well, as long as you keep opening the door, but don't kill
Yeah,
yourself over it, because we have to
yeah,
have some
yeah.
expectations of how God made us just to accept it, but then also to get
Yeah.
over ourselves if necessary."
Yeah, there can be kind of a false pride in that too. That's comical. There's an expression in Newfoundland where I'm from. They have a lot of funny expressions. But one thing that a very particular housekeeper will almost always say when someone comes to their door, well, come in if you can get in. Meaning the house is a mess. And people find that really annoying when they come in and find that everything is absolutely perfect in the house. Because
You
it's like
get
she's
in.
drawing attention to the fact that, you know,
If
saying, come in if you can get in.
you can get in.
And I heard people say, I wish they wouldn't say that. It's just so annoying. But it's kind of like a kind of a self-aggrandizing joke,
Right.
because you
I
look
was,
around and you think there's nothing here to trip over.
yeah, yeah, you should see my house. Um, I think there's a lot of insecurities. And when I think about my own insecurities, then I'm thinking about myself instead of my guest. And so God convicts me again.
Yes, yes.
The reason you're uptight right now and you're yelling at your husband to get the chairs out because you asked him 2 hours ago to get the chairs out. And then it kind of ruins the whole spiritual aspect of having somebody over. And then I think, oh, do I really care about the guest or am I caring more about myself? And I think that's just a spiritual thing that we just talk to God about, and he grows us up in it. Which kind of goes into the next question, how is God changing you as a hostess, Janice?
Well, I think I have to honor people's individuality and their strangeness more than I found myself thinking about the word stranger, and there's strangers in the sense that you don't know them, you never talked to them or spent time with them before, but they also can be strange people, and
That's for
you
sure.
just have to put up with their strangeness and not let it annoy you.
Uh-huh.
I don't think I was very good at that for a very long time. And approaching intimacy was the topic for my last of my four sections on hospitality that I had for my study. And I think that I felt that the goal was that the meal was enjoyable and comfortable, and people could, had things that they liked to eat, and we had some conversation that seemed well balanced. But that whole idea of approaching intimacy, of really getting to know people and bringing something up that will um, allow them to be who they are. I had a situation a couple of years ago, a summer home in Newfoundland where we had guests visiting from California. Actually, we hadn't seen for a long while, and not Hyde and Ann, but another couple that we knew in Wycliffe. And unexpectedly, someone else contacted me, not to come, but to say she would be in the area. She had never been in our area before. She was traveling with her husband and teenage children, and she was a daughter of a very dear friend, and he had said contact them, and I felt like I had to invite them, but I felt in my spirit a bit resentful because I felt like it would spoil the dynamic of being
Right.
with the friends that we knew well.
Oh,
And
no.
God just used that because the conversation turned to something that was very sensitive in the family, that came up right away, sort of unexpectedly. And then the visitor, the woman who I hadn't planned on having, became very disturbed, and the friends, the Wycliffe friends, were there. The wife was just, she knew about that situation. She was able to build a bridge. She was able to comfort her, and God just used it. And I thought, if that couple with their two teenage kids had come when the other couple from California weren't there, I would never have been able to create the warm environment that ended up being created. That combination was really what the Holy Spirit was able to use
Mhm.
and bless the relationship that developed between those two who I would have thought had nothing in common. They were Christians, but from very different backgrounds and very different personalities. And I just felt that I like to plan, things that I have a whole lot of guests that come in the summer. I've like 40, 50 different people stay overnight in a
Wow.
given 4-month period, three month period or less. And some I know well, some I don't. And you like to feel like you plan out if people overlap, they're suitable. And you know what? You don't know all the factors the Lord knows.
That's right. The Lord.
There's something about his timing that will be far above yours.
Mhm. That's true of every aspect of our lives, but I think we forget that
Yeah.
that's so true in doing hospitality so we can feel less stress, be at more peace. But it's a matter of trust. Whenever we obey God, it's a matter of trust that He's going to work the best thing out for it. Um, One thing we like to use actually is from Hyatt, your friend and my brother's idea, is to do conversation starters. He was at a dinner party, excuse me, not at your house, where he was bored. And he said, it was such a boring dinner party. So I just decided to ask everybody, how about if everybody here shares where you were living when you were 10 and what you were doing? And he goes, and I'll start. He's easy with words and like me. And he said, well, and when I was 10, I had a paper route in Milwaukee, Wisconsin with my little brother. And so then everybody went around the table. And then he said, that went so well. He was telling me the story later. He goes, Sue, that went so well that I asked another follow-up question. And then he did add, he goes, if it had not gone well, I would not have done any more because it wasn't my house. I wasn't the host. I didn't want to take it over completely. And he said, so then where were you living and what were you doing when you were 22? And then he did it one more time. And what that did, Janice, was it caused people to find connections with people across the table, maybe 5, 6 people down the table. And then
Yes.
afterwards, they were able to connect. And it's like a networking thing.
Right.
And then he said there was one young woman there that he didn't really care for, but because of what she shared about her earlier life, it made him more empathetic. So it's kind of like what
Yes.
happened at your table, only in a
Yes.
lesser way. But he was
Yes.
praising the Lord for it. And based on that, that's why I do conversation starters.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so great. Do you see part of your legacy as passing on biblical hospitality in teaching as well as modeling it?
Yes, I think so. I think that modeling it is still important for the family and for even our grandkids. Our oldest now has his own home, and even though he's a single guy, he has people in. And sometimes I just talk to him about some of the issues that I've brought up in my study, and it's something that he likes to talk about now that he finds the thing about inviting his friends and they don't let him know whether they're coming or not, or they come and bring three or four others,
Yeah.
like, but I think that in researching to teach it, I've come up with some things that God has um, challenged me with. And one thing I was going to mention was the idea of Martha, because I found myself thinking about many Bible stories in depth that I use, but that story, and people think, well, the point is not to be Martha. But I don't think that's the point at all, because later in the Bible story, the two other times she occurs, she is the one that goes to Jesus and kneels and says, Lord, if you were not here, my brother would not have died. And that she's the one that says, you're the resurrection and the life. So she has a deep spiritual perceptiveness. And in a later incident, they were at that house in Bethany and Martha served. She hasn't abandoned her role as server. She's still the hostess, but she has changed her attitude. And
Mhm.
so it's not being the hostess and being busy. It's being distracted, as Jesus said. I guess it depends on different words in different translations, but I think one of the commonly used words now, Jesus reprimand, or even maybe reprimand is almost too strong. His gentle chiding of her as you're distracted by many things. And so distracted is the opposite of focused. And so to be a focused hostess rather than a distracted one, there's nothing wrong with being the hostess. And so,
No, and there's that, and also I feel like when
yeah,
I'm more prepared, like my mom making Jello and lemon velvet cake the day before, so she was prepared, makes us more focused on our guest, which is what God,
yes,
Jesus is always our guest as well as we are his. And then he brings us guests that need our focus. But if I'm running around like a chicken with no head, I'm not focusing on my guest.
right,
Yeah.
yes,
Oh, that's so beautiful. Um, I was going to add one more thing. Oh, yeah. A friend of mine invited the college group for dinner when we had a small college group because it was in between pastors. And so I said, well, how'd it go? She goes, well, they told me I would have 20 kids. So I made chili and I ended up with 30 kids. And I said, why? That's a really big discrepancy. 10 more college kids because they eat a lot. And she goes, well, there was exactly no food left over, but everybody had enough. I said, well, that sounds biblical. And so I said, why were there 10 extra? She goes, because one college kid had 10 friends visiting from San Francisco. And he said, come on, get on the bus. We're going to the Patty's house for dinner. And it's kind of funny, but the Lord provided. That
yeah,
was the point. The Lord, that thing will happen to us, but we don't need to panic.
right,
We might panic more having a sit down dinner party. It just depends on what we need to grow in. So we grow in trust, faith, believing, and then we watch God change our lives as well as the lives
sure,
of those who come.
sure.
Well, any last words on hospitality? This has been delightful, Janice.
No, but I think just the one thing that I didn't come up in our conversation, but that struck me a great deal when I was reading about is that poverty is often the thing that motivates people to share more rather than wealth.
Mm,
That sometimes it's the communities that have most poverty where people will share what they have with others, that poverty fosters generosity of spirit. And I hadn't really thought about that, but I think there's many instances where it is true and in scripture, you see, the widow providing the oil and wine for the prophet. And there's a kind of a preciousness in that idea that it's not out of our abundance, but out of our poverty that God use this, and as we realize our poverty of even spiritual resources as well as physical resources, and we serve God out of whether it's literal
Mhm.
or figurative poverty, the blessing of God's enrichment of our hospitality occurs.
Right. And what a blessing to be part of that, to be a conduit of God's richness. Boy, if you haven't been encouraged today, folks, if you're feeling poor in spirit, that's how we're blessed. If you're feeling poor in pocket, God will use our poverty in a greater way, because He will be the one on display, because you know that you can't do it. In fact, I feel like whenever I feel inadequate in podcasting, speaking, writing, mothering, wifing, that's when God can shine through more abundantly. So thank you for adding that. I'm so glad you did. I had read that in your course, and I thought, wow, that is a precious understanding of what God can do in spite of ourselves, not because of how great we are. So you can find Dr. Janice Brown on Facebook, her writer's page, and also her book page on Amazon. So thank you so much. I hope you've enjoyed this, Janice, as much as we have.
Thank you.